The Argentine pampas extend from the 34th to the 40th degree of southern latitude. The word pampa, of Araucanian origin, signifies grass plain and justly applies to the whole region. The mimosas growing on the western part and the substantial herbage on the eastern give those plains a peculiar appearance. The soil is composed of sand and red or yellow clay, and this is covered by a layer of earth, in which the vegetation takes root. The geologist would find rich treasures in the tertiary strata here, for it is full of antediluvian remains, enormous bones, which the Indians attribute to some gigantic race that lived in a past age. The horses went on at a good pace through the thick paja brava, the grass of the pampas, par excellence, so high and thick that the Indians find shelter in it from storms. At certain distances, but increasingly seldom, there were wet, marshy spots, almost entirely underwater, where the willows grew, and a plant called the Gygnerium argenteum. Here the horses drank their fill greedily, as if bent on quenching their thirst for past, present, and future. Thalcave went first to beat the bushes and frighten away the colinas, a most dangerous species of viper, the bite of which kills an ox in less than an hour. For 2 days they plodded steadily across this arid and deserted plain. The dry heat became severe. There were not only no rios, but even the ponds dug out by the Indians were dried up. As the drought seemed to increase with every mile, Paganel asked Thalcave when he expected to come to water. "At Lake Salinas," replied the Indian. "And when shall we get there?" "Tomorrow evening." When the Argentines travel in the pampas, they generally dig wells and find water a few feet below the surface. But the travelers could not fall back on this resource, not having the necessary implements. They were therefore obliged to husband the small provision of water they had still left and deal it out in rations, so that if no one had enough to satisfy his thirst, no one felt it too painful. They halted at evening after a course of 30 miles and eagerly looked forward to a good night's rest to compensate for the fatigue of day. But their slumbers were invaded by a swarm of mosquitoes, which allowed them no peace. Their presence indicated a change of wind which shifted to the north. A south or southwest wind generally puts to flight these little pests. Even these petty ills of life could not ruffle the major's equanimity. But Paganel, on the contrary, was perfectly exasperated by such trifling annoyances. He abused the poor mosquitoes desperately, and deplored the lack of some acid lotion which would have eased the pain of their stings. The major did his best to console him by reminding him of the fact that they had only to do with one species of insect, among the 300,000 naturalists reckon. He would listen to nothing, and got up in a very bad temper. He was quite willing to start at daybreak, however, for they had to get to Lake Salinas before sundown. The horses were tired out and dying for water, and though their riders had stinted themselves for their sakes, still their ration was very insufficient. The drought was constantly increasing, and the heat none the less for the wind being north, this wind being the simoom of the pampas. There was a brief interruption this day to the monotony of the journey. Mulready, who was in front of the others, rode hastily back to report the approach of a troop of Indians. The news was received with very different feelings by Glenarvan and Thalcave. The Scotchman was glad of the chance of gleaning some information about his shipwrecked countrymen, while the Patagonian hardly cared to encounter the nomadic Indians of the prairie, knowing their bandit propensities. He rather sought to avoid them, and gave orders to his party to have their arms in readiness for any trouble. Presently the nomads came in sight, and the Patagonian was reassured at finding they were only 10 in number. They came within 100 yards of them and stopped. This was near enough to observe them distinctly. They were fine specimens of the native races, which had been almost entirely swept away in 1833 by General Rosas, tall in stature, with arched forehead and olive complexion. They were dressed in guanaco skins and carried lances 20 feet long, knives, slings, boluses, and lassos, and by their dexterity in the management of their horses, showed themselves to be accomplished riders. They appeared to have stopped for the purpose of holding a council with each other, for they shouted and gesticulated at a great rate. Glenarvan determined to go up to them, but he had no sooner moved forward than the whole band wheeled round and disappeared with incredible speed. It would have been useless for the travelers to attempt to overtake them with such worn-out horses. "The cowards!" exclaimed Paganel. "They scampered off too quick for honest folks," said McNabbs. "Who are these Indians, Thalcave?" asked Paganel. "Gauchos." "The Gauchos!" cried Paganel, and turning to his companions he added, "We need not have been so much on our guard, there was nothing to fear." How is that? Asked McNabbs. Because the gauchos are inoffensive peasants. You believe that, Paganel? Certainly I do. They took us for robbers and fled in terror. I rather think they did not dare to attack us, replied Glenarvan, much vexed at not being able to enter into some sort of communication with those Indians, whatever they were. That's my opinion too, said the Major, for if I am not mistaken, instead of being harmless, the gauchos are formidable out-and-out bandits. The idea, exclaimed Paganel, and forthwith commenced a lively discussion of this ethnological thesis, so lively that the Major became excited, and, quite contrary to his usual suavity, said bluntly, I believe you are wrong, Paganel. Wrong, replied Paganel. Yes, Thalcave took them for robbers, and he knows what he is talking about. Well, Thalcave was mistaken this time, retorted Paganel, somewhat sharply. The gauchos are agriculturists and shepherds and nothing else, as I have stated in a pamphlet on the natives of the Pampas, written by me, which has attracted some notice. Well, well, you have committed an error, that's all, Monsieur Paganel. What, Monsieur McNabbs, you tell me I have committed an error. An inadvertence, if you like, which you can put among the errata in the next edition. Paganel, highly incensed at his geographical knowledge being brought in question, and even jested about, allowed his ill humor to get the better of him, and said, No, sir, that my books have no need of such errata. Indeed, well, on this occasion they have, at any rate, retorted McNabbs, quite as obstinate as his opponent. Sir, I think you are very annoying today. And I think you are very crabbed. Glenarvan thought it was high time to interfere, for the discussion was getting too hot, so he said, Come, now, there is no doubt one of you is very teasing, and the other is very crabbed, and I must say I am surprised at both of you. The Patagonian, without understanding the cause, could see that the two friends were quarreling. He began to smile and said quietly, It's the north wind. The north wind, exclaimed Paganel. What's the north wind to do with it? Ah, it is just that, said Glenarvan. It's the north wind that has put you in a bad temper. I have heard that in South America, the wind greatly irritates the nervous system. By St. Patrick, Edward, you are right, said the Major, laughing heartily. But Paganel, in a towering rage, would not give up the contest, and turned upon Glenarvan, whose intervention in this jesting manner he resented. And so, my lord, my nervous system is irritated, he said. Yes, Paganel, it is the north wind, a wind which causes many a crime in the Pampas, as the Tramontane does in the Campagna of Rome. Crimes, returned the geographer. Do I look like a man that would commit crimes? That's not exactly what I said. Tell me at once that I want to assassinate you. Well, I am really afraid, replied Glenarvan, bursting into an uncontrollable fit of laughter, in which all others joined. Paganel said no more, but went off in front alone, and came back in a few minutes quite himself, as if he had completely forgotten his grievance. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Thalcave, who was considerably in advance of the rest, descried in the distance the much-desired lake, and in less than a quarter of an hour they reached its banks. But a grievous disappointment awaited them. The lake was dried up. Chapter 18, In Search of Water. Lake Salinas ends the string of lagoons connected with the Sierras Ventana and Guamini. Numerous expeditions were formerly made there from Buenos Aires to collect the salt deposited on its banks, as the waters contain great quantities of chloride of sodium. But when Thalcave spoke of the lake as supplying drinkable water, he was thinking of the rios of fresh water which run into it. Those streams, however, were all dried up also. The burning sun had drunk up everything liquid, and the consternation of the travelers may be imagined at the discovery. Some action must be taken immediately, however, for what little water still remained was almost bad, and could not quench thirst. Hunger and fatigue were forgotten in the face of this imperious necessity. A sort of leather tent, called a rauca, which had been left by the natives, afforded the party a temporary resting place, and the weary horses stretched themselves along the muddy banks, and tried to browse on the marine plants and dry reeds they found there, nauseous to the taste as they must have been. As soon as the whole party were ensconced in the rauca, Paganel asked Thalcave what he thought was best to be done. A rapid conversation followed, a few words of which were intelligible to Glenarvan. Thalcave spoke calmly, but the lively Frenchman gesticulated enough for both. After a little, Thalcave sat silent and folded his arms. "What does he say?" asked Glenarvan. "I fancied he was advising us to separate." "Yes, into two parties. Those of us whose horses are so done out with fatigue and thirst that they can scarcely drag one leg after the other, are to continue the route as they best can, while the others, whose steeds are fresher, are to push on in advance toward the river Guamini, which throws itself into Lake San Lucas about 31 miles off. If there should be water enough in the river, they are to wait on the banks till their companions reach them. But should it be dried up, they will hasten back and spare them a useless journey." "And what will we do then?" asked Austin. "Then we shall have to make up our minds to go 72 miles south, as far as the commencement of the Sierra Ventana, where rivers abound. It is wise counsel, and we will act upon it without loss of time. My horse is in tolerable good trim, and I volunteer to accompany Thalcave." "Oh, my lord, take me," said Robert, as if it were a question of some pleasure party. "But would you be able for it, my boy?" "Oh, I have a fine beast which just wants to have a gallop. Please, my lord, to take me." "Come then, my boy," said Glenarvan, delighted not to leave Robert behind. "If we three don't manage to find out fresh water somewhere," he added, "we must be very stupid." "Well, well, and what about me?" said Paganel. "Oh, my dear Paganel, you must stay with the reserve corps," replied the major. "You are too well acquainted with the 37th parallel and the river Guamini and the whole Pampas for us to let you go. Neither Mulready, nor Wilson, nor myself would be able to rejoin Thalcave at the given rendezvous, but we will put ourselves under the banner of the brave Jacques Paganel with perfect confidence." "I resign myself," said the geographer, much flattered at having supreme command. "But mind, Paganel, no distractions," added the major. "Don't you take us to the wrong place, to the borders of the Pacific, for instance." "Oh, you insufferable major, it would serve you right," replied Paganel, laughing. "But how will you manage to understand what Thalcave says, Glenarvan?" he continued. "I suppose," replied Glenarvan, "the Patagonian and I won't have much to talk about. Besides, I know a few Spanish words, and at a pinch, I should not fear either making him understand me, or my understanding him." "Go then, my worthy friend," said Paganel. "We'll have supper first," rejoined Glenarvan, "and then sleep if we can till it is starting time." The supper was not very reviving without drink of any kind, and they tried to make up for the lack of it by a good sleep. But Paganel dreamed of water all night, of torrents and cascades, and rivers and ponds and streams and brooks. In fact, he had a complete nightmare. Next morning at 6 o'clock, the horses of Thalcave, Glenarvan, and Robert were got ready. Their last ration of water was given them, and drunk with more avidity than satisfaction, for it was filthy, disgusting stuff. The three travelers then jumped into their saddles and set off, shouting au revoir to their companions. "Don't come back whatever you do," called Paganel after them. The Desertio de las Salinas, which they had to traverse, is a dry plain, covered with stunted trees not above 10 feet high, and small mimosas, which the Indians call curramamel, and jumes, a bushy shrub rich in soda. Here and there large spaces were covered with salt, which sparkled in the sunlight with astonishing brilliancy. These might easily have been taken for sheets of ice, had not the intense heat forbidden the illusion. And the contrast these dazzling white sheets presented to the dry, burned-up ground gave the desert a most peculiar character. 80 miles south, on the contrary, the Sierra Ventana, toward which the travelers might possibly have to betake themselves should the Guamini disappoint their hopes, the landscape was totally different. There the fertility is splendid, the pasturage is incomparable. Unfortunately, to reach them would necessitate a march of 130 miles south, and this was why Thalcave thought it best to go first to Guamini, as it was not only much nearer, but also on the direct line of route. The three horses went forward might and main, as if instinctively knowing whither they were bound. Thaouka especially displayed a courage that neither fatigue nor hunger could damp. He bounded like a bird over the dried-up Canadas and the bushes of curramamel, his loud, joyous neighing seeming to bode success to the search. The horses of Glenarvan and Robert, though not so light-footed, felt the spur of his example and followed him bravely. Thalcave inspirited his companions as much as Thaouka did his four-footed brethren. He sat motionless in the saddle, but often turned his head to look at Robert, and ever and anon gave him a shout of encouragement and approval as he saw how well he rode. Certainly the boy deserved praise, for he was fast becoming an excellent cavalier. Bravo, Robert, said Glenarvan. Thalcave is evidently congratulating you, my boy, and paying you compliments. What for, my lord? For your good horsemanship. I can hold firm on, that's all, replied Robert, blushing with pleasure at such an encomium. That is the principal thing, Robert, but you are too modest. I tell you that some day you will turn out an accomplished horseman. What would Papa say to that? Said Robert, laughing. He wants me to be a sailor. The one won't hinder the other. If all cavaliers wouldn't make good sailors, there is no reason why all sailors should not make good horsemen. To keep one's footing on the yards must teach a man to hold on firm, and as to managing the reins and making a horse go through all sorts of movements, that's easily acquired. Indeed, it comes naturally. Poor father, said Robert, how he will thank you for saving his life. You love him very much, Robert. Yes, my lord, dearly. He was so good to me and my sister. We were his only thought, and whenever he came home from his voyages, we were sure of some souvenir from all the places he had been to, and, better still, of loving words and caresses. Ah, if you knew him, you would love him, too. Mary is most like him. He has a soft voice like hers. That's strange for a sailor, isn't it? Yes, Robert, very strange. I see him still, the boy went on, as if speaking to himself. Good, brave papa. He put me to sleep on his knee, crooning an old Scotch ballad about the locks of our country. The time sometimes comes back to me, but very confused like. So it does to Mary, too? Ah, my lord, how we loved him. Well, I do think one needs to be little to love one's father like that. Yes, and to be grown up, my child, to venerate him, replied Glenarvan, deeply touched by the boy's genuine affection. During this conversation, the horses had been slackening speed, and were only walking now. You will find him, said Robert again, after a few minutes' silence. Yes, we'll find him, was Glenarvan's reply. Thalcave has set us on the track, and I have great confidence in him. Thalcave is a brave Indian, isn't he? Said the boy. That indeed he is. Do you know something, my lord? What is it, and then I will tell you. That all the people you have with you are brave. Lady Helena, whom I love so, and the Major, with his calm manner, and Captain Mangles, and Monsieur Paganel, and all the sailors on the Duncan. How courageous and devoted they are. Yes, my boy, I know that, replied Glenarvan. And do you know that you are the best of all? No, most certainly I don't know that. Well, it is time you did, my lord, said the boy, seizing his lordship's hand and covering it with kisses. Glenarvan shook his head, but said no more, as a gesture from Thalcave made them spur on their horses and hurry forward. But it was soon evident that, with the exception of Thaouka, the wearied animals could not go quicker than a walking pace. At noon they were obliged to let them rest for an hour. They could not go on at all, and refused to eat the alfafairs, a poor, burnt-up sort of lucerne that grew there. Glenarvan began to be uneasy. Tokens of sterility were not the least on the decrease, and the want of water might involve serious calamities. Thalcave said nothing, thinking probably that it would be time enough to despair if the Guamini should be dried up, if, indeed, the heart of an Indian can ever despair. Spur and whip had both to be employed to induce the poor animals to resume the route, and then they only crept along, for their strength was gone. Thaouka, indeed, could have galloped swiftly enough, and reached the Rio in a few hours, but Thalcave would not leave his companions behind, alone in the midst of a desert. It was hard work, however, to get the animal to consent to walk quietly. He kicked and reared and neighed violently, and was subdued at last more by his master's voice than hand. Thalcave positively talked to the beast, and Thaouka understood perfectly, though unable to reply, for, after a great deal of arguing, the noble creature yielded, though he still champed the bit. Thalcave did not understand Thaouka. It turned out, though Thaouka understood him. The intelligent animal felt humidity in the atmosphere, and drank it in with frenzy, moving and making a noise with his tongue, as if taking deep draughts of some cool, refreshing liquid. The Patagonian could not mistake him now. Water was not far off. The two other horses seemed to catch their comrade's meaning, and, inspired by his example, made a last effort and galloped forward after the Indian. About 3 o'clock, a white line appeared in a dip of the road, and seemed to tremble in the sunlight. Water! Exclaimed Glenarvan. Yes, yes, it is water, shouted Robert. They were right, and the horses knew it too, for there was no need now to urge them on. They tore over the ground as if mad, and in a few minutes had reached the river and plunged in up to their chests. Their masters had to go on too, whether they would or not, but they were so rejoiced at being able to quench their thirst, that this compulsory bath was no grievance. "Oh, how delicious this is!" exclaimed Robert, taking a deep draught. "Drink moderately, my boy," said Glenarvan, but he did not set the example. Thalcave drank very quietly, without hurrying himself, taking small gulps, but as long as a lazo, as the Patagonians say. He seemed as if he were never going to leave off, and really there was some danger of his swallowing up the whole river. At last Glenarvan said, "Well, our friends won't be disappointed this time. They will be sure of finding clear, cool water when they get here. That is to say, if Thalcave leaves any for them. But couldn't we go to meet them? It would spare them several hours' suffering and anxiety." "You're right, my boy, but how could we carry them this water?" The leather bottles were left with Wilson. "No, it is better for us to wait for them as we agreed. They can't be here till about the middle of the night, so the best thing we can do is to get a good bed and a good supper ready for them." Thalcave had not waited for Glenarvan's proposition to prepare an encampment. He had been fortunate enough to discover on the banks of the Rio a ramada, a sort of enclosure, which had served as a fold for flocks, and was shut in on three sides. A more suitable place could not be found for their night's lodging, provided they had no fear of sleeping in the open air beneath the starlit heavens, and none of Thalcave's companions had much solicitude on that score. Accordingly, they took possession at once, and stretched themselves at full length on the ground in the bright sunshine, to dry their dripping garments. "Well, now we've secured a lodging, we must think of supper," said Glenarvan. "Our friends must not have reason to complain of the couriers they sent to precede them, and if I am not much mistaken, they will be very satisfied. It strikes me that an hour's shooting won't be lost time. Are you ready, Robert?" "Yes, my lord," replied the boy, standing up, gun in hand. Why Glenarvan proposed this was, that the banks of the Guamini seemed to be the general rendezvous of all the game in the surrounding plains. A sort of partridge peculiar to the pampas, called tinamus, blackwood hens, a species of plover called teru, yellow rays, and waterfowl with magnificent green plumage rose in coveys. No quadrupeds, however, were visible, but Thalcave pointed to the long grass and thick brushwood, and gave his friends to understand they were lying there in concealment. Disdaining the feathered tribes when more substantial game was at hand, the hunters' first shots were fired into the underwood. Instantly, there rose by the hundred roebucks and guanacos, like those that had swept over them that terrible night on the Cordilleras, but the timid creatures were so frightened that they were all out of gunshot in a twinkling. The hunters were obliged to content themselves with humbler game, though in an alimentary point of view nothing better could be wished. A dozen of red partridges and rays were speedily brought down, and Glenarvan also managed very cleverly to kill a tay-tetter, or peccary, a pachydermatous animal, the flesh of which is excellent eating. In less than half an hour the hunters had all the game they required. Robert had killed a curious animal belonging to the order Edentata, an armadillo, a sort of tattoo, covered with a hard bony shell, in movable pieces, and measuring 1.5 feet long. It was very fat and would make an excellent dish, the Patagonians said. Robert was very proud of his success. Thalcave did his part by capturing a nandu, a species of ostrich, remarkable for its extreme swiftness. There could be no entrapping such an animal, and the Indian did not attempt it. He urged Thayuka to a gallop, and made a direct attack, knowing that if the first aim missed the nandu would soon tire out horse and rider by involving them in an inextricable labyrinth of windings. The moment, therefore, that Thalcave got to a right distance, he flung his boluses with such a powerful hand, and so skillfully, that he caught the bird round the legs and paralyzed his efforts at once. In a few seconds it lay flat on the ground. The Indian had not made his capture for the mere pleasure and glory of such a novel chase. The flesh of the nandu is highly esteemed, and Thalcave felt bound to contribute his share of the common repast. They returned to the ramada, bringing back the string of partridges, the ostrich, the peccary, and the armadillo. The ostrich and the peccary were prepared for cooking by divesting them of their tough skins and cutting them up into thin slices. As to the armadillo, he carries his cooking apparatus with him, and all that had to be done was to place him in his own shell over the glowing embers. The substantial dishes were reserved for the night comers, and the three hunters contented themselves with devouring the partridges and washed down their meal with clear, fresh water, which was pronounced superior to all the porter in the world, even to the famous Highland usquebaugh or whiskey. The horses had not been overlooked. A large quantity of dry fodder was discovered lying heaped up in the ramada, and this supplied them amply with both food and bedding. When all was ready, the three companions wrapped themselves in the ponchos and stretched themselves on an eiderdown of alfafairs, the usual bed of hunters on the pampas. Chapter 19: The Red Wolves. Night came, but the orb of night was invisible to the inhabitants of the earth, for she was just in her first quarter. The dim light of the stars was all that illumined the plain. The waters of the Guamini ran silently, like a sheet of oil over a surface of marble. Birds, quadrupeds, and reptiles were resting motionless after the fatigues of the day, and the silence of the desert brooded over the far-spreading pampas. Glenarvan, Robert, and Thalcave had followed the common example, and lay in profound slumber on their soft couch of lucerne. The worn-out horses had stretched themselves full length on the ground, except Theayuka, who slept standing, true to his high blood, proud in repose as in action, and ready to start at his master's call. Absolute silence reigned within the enclosure, over which the dying embers of the fire shed a fitful light. However, the Indian's sleep did not last long. For about 10 o'clock he woke, sat up, and turned his ear toward the plain, listening intently, with half-closed eyes. An uneasy look began to depict itself on his usually impassive face. Had he caught scent of some party of Indian marauders, or of jaguars, water tigers, and other terrible animals that haunt the neighborhood of rivers? Apparently it was the latter, for he threw a rapid glance on the combustible materials heaped up in the enclosure, and the expression of anxiety on his countenance seemed to deepen. This was not surprising, as the whole pile of alfafairs would soon burn out and could only ward off the attacks of wild beasts for a brief interval. There was nothing to be done in the circumstances but wait. And wait he did, in a half-recumbent posture, his head leaning on his hands and his elbows on his knees, like a man roused suddenly from his night's sleep. A whole hour passed, and anyone except Thalcave would have lain down again on his couch, reassured by the silence round him. But where a stranger would have suspected nothing, the sharpened senses of the Indian detected the approach of danger. As he was thus watching and listening, Theayuka gave a low neigh and stretched his nostrils toward the entrance of the ramada. This startled the Patagonian and made him rise to his feet at once. Theayuka scents an enemy, he said to himself, going toward the opening to make careful survey of the plains. Silence still prevailed, but not tranquility, for Thalcave caught a glimpse of shadows moving noiselessly over the tufts of curramamel. Here and there luminous spots appeared, dying out and rekindling constantly, in all directions, like fantastic lights dancing over the surface of an immense lagoon. An inexperienced eye might have mistaken them for fireflies, which shine at night in many parts of the pampas, but Thalcave was not deceived. He knew the enemies he had to deal with, and lost no time in loading his carbine and taking up his post in front of the fence. He did not wait long for a strange cry. A confused sound of barking and howling broke over the pampas, followed next instant by the report of the carbine, which made the uproar 100 times worse. Glenarvan and Robert woke in alarm and started to their feet instantly. "What is it?" exclaimed Robert. "Is it the Indians?" asked Glenarvan. "No," replied Thalcave, "the Agaras." "Agaras?" said Robert, looking inquiringly at Glenarvan. "Yes," replied Glenarvan, "the red wolves of the pampas." They seized their weapons at once, and stationed themselves beside the Patagonian, who pointed toward the plain from whence the yelling resounded. Robert drew back involuntarily. "You are not afraid of wolves, my boy," said Glenarvan. "No, my lord," said the lad in a firm tone, "and moreover, beside you I am afraid of nothing." "So much the better. These Agaras are not very formidable either, and if it were not for their number I should not give them a thought." "Never mind, we are all well armed, let them come." "We'll certainly give them a warm reception," rejoined Glenarvan. His lordship only spoke thus to reassure the child, for a secret terror filled him at the sight of this legion of bloodthirsty animals let loose on them at midnight. There might possibly be some hundreds, and what could 3 men do, even armed to the teeth, against such a multitude? As soon as Thalcave said the word Agara, Glenarvan knew that he meant the red wolf, for this is the name given to it by the Pampas Indians. This voracious animal, called by naturalists the canis jubatus, is in shape like a large dog and has the head of a fox. Its fur is a reddish cinnamon color, and there is a black mane all down the back. It is a strong, nimble animal, generally inhabiting marshy places and pursuing aquatic animals by swimming, prowling about by night and sleeping during the day. Its attacks are particularly dreaded at the estancias or sheep stations, as it often commits considerable ravages, carrying off the finest of the flock. Singly, the agora is not much to be feared, but they generally go in immense packs, and one had better have to deal with a jaguar or cougar than with them. Both from the noise of the howling and the multitude of shadows leaping about, Glenarvan had a pretty good idea of the number of the wolves, and he knew they had scented a good meal of human flesh or horse flesh, and none of them would go back to their dens without a share. It was certainly a very alarming situation to be in. The assailants were gradually drawing closer. The horses displayed signs of the liveliest terror, with the exception of Theayuka, who stamped his foot and tried to break loose and get out. His master could only calm him by keeping up a low, continuous whistle. Glenarvan and Robert had posted themselves so as to defend the opening of the ramada. They were just going to fire into the nearest ranks of the wolves when Thalcave lowered their weapons. "What does Thalcave mean?" asked Robert. "He forbids our firing." "And why?" "Perhaps he thinks it is not the right time." But this was not the Indian's reason, and so Glenarvan saw when he lifted the powder flask, showed him it was nearly empty. "What's wrong?" asked Robert. "We must husband our ammunition," was the reply. "Today's shooting has cost us dear, and we are short of powder and shot. We can't fire more than 20 times. The boy made no reply, and Glenarvan asked him if he was frightened. "No, my lord," he said. "That's right," returned Glenarvan. A fresh report resounded that instant. Thalcave had made short work of one assailant more audacious than the rest, and the infuriated pack had retreated to within 100 steps of the enclosure. On a sign from the Indian, Glenarvan took his place, while Thalcave went back into the enclosure and gathered up all the dried grass and alfafairs, and indeed, all the combustibles he could rake together, and made a pile of them at the entrance. Into this he flung one of the still glowing embers, and soon the bright flames shot up into the dark night. Glenarvan could now get a good glimpse of his antagonists, and saw that it was impossible to exaggerate their numbers or their fury. The barrier of fire just raised by Thalcave had redoubled their anger, though it had cut off their approach. Several of them, however, urged on by the hindmost ranks, pushed forward into the very flames, and burned their paws for their pains. From time to time, another shot had to be fired, notwithstanding the fire, to keep off the howling pack, and in the course of an hour 15 dead animals lay stretched on the prairie. The situation of the besieged was, relatively speaking, less dangerous now. As long as the powder lasted and the barrier of fire burned on, there was no fear of being overmastered. But what was to be done afterward, when both means of defense failed at once? Glenarvan's heart swelled as he looked at Robert. He forgot himself in thinking of this poor child, as he saw him showing a courage so far above his years. Robert was pale, but he kept his gun steady, and stood with firm foot ready to meet the attacks of the infuriated wolves. However, after Glenarvan had calmly surveyed the actual state of affairs, he determined to bring things to a crisis. "In an hour's time," he said, "we shall neither have powder nor fire. It will never do to wait till then before we settle what to do." Accordingly, he went up to Thalcave, and tried to talk to him by the help of the few Spanish words his memory could muster, though their conversation was often interrupted by one or the other having to fire a shot. It was no easy task for the two men to understand each other, but most fortunately, Glenarvan knew a great deal of the peculiarities of the red wolf. Otherwise, he could never have interpreted the Indian's words and gestures. As it was, fully a quarter of an hour elapsed before he could get any answer from Thalcave to tell Robert in reply to his inquiry. "What does he say?" "He says that at any price we must hold out till daybreak. The agora only prowls about at night and goes back to his lair with the first streak of dawn. It is a cowardly beast that loves the darkness and dreads the light, an owl on 4 feet. Very well, let us defend ourselves then till morning." "Yes, my boy, and with knife thrusts when gun and shots fail." Already Thalcave had set the example. for whenever a wolf came too near the burning pile, the long arm of the Patagonian dashed through the flames and came out again reddened with blood. But very soon this means of defense would be at an end. About 2 o'clock, Thalcave flung his last armful of combustibles into the fire, and barely enough powder remained to load a gun 5 times. Glenarvan threw a sorrowful glance round him. He thought of the lad standing there, and of his companions and those left behind, whom he loved so dearly. Robert was silent. Perhaps the danger seemed less imminent to his imagination. But Glenarvan thought for him, and pictured to himself the horrible fate that seemed to await him inevitably. Quite overcome by his emotion, he took the child in his arms, and straining him convulsively to his heart, pressed his lips on his forehead, while tears he could not restrain streamed down his cheeks. Robert looked up into his face with a smile and said, "I am not frightened." "No, my child, no, and you are right. In 2 hours daybreak will come, and we shall be saved. Bravo, Thalcave, my brave Patagonian. Bravo," he added as the Indian that moment leveled 2 enormous beasts who endeavored to leap across the barrier of flames. But the fire was fast dying out, and the denouement of the terrible drama was approaching. The flames got lower and lower. Once more the shadows of night fell on the prairie, and the glaring eyes of the wolves glowed like phosphorescent balls in the darkness. A few minutes longer, and the whole pack would be in the enclosure. Thalcave loaded his carbine for the last time, killed one more enormous monster, and then folded his arms. His head sank on his chest, and he appeared buried in deep thought. Was he planning some daring, impossible, mad attempt to repulse the infuriated horde? Glenarvan did not venture to ask. At this very moment, the wolves began to change their tactics. The deafening howls suddenly ceased, they seemed to be going away. Gloomy silence spread over the prairie and made Robert exclaim, "They're gone." But Thalcave, guessing his meaning, shook his head. He knew they would never relinquish their sure prey till daybreak made them hasten back to their dens. Still, their plan of attack had evidently been altered. They no longer attempted to force the entrance, but their new maneuvers only heightened the danger. They had gone round the ramada, as by common consent, and were trying to get in on the opposite side. The next minute they heard their claws attacking the moldering wood, and already formidable paws and hungry, savage jaws had found their way through the palings. The terrified horses broke loose from their halters and ran about the enclosure, mad with fear. Glenarvan put his arms round the young lad, and resolved to defend him as long as his life held out. Possibly he might have made a useless attempt at flight when his eye fell on Thalcave. The Indian had been stalking about the ramada like a stag, when he suddenly stopped short, and going up to his horse, who was trembling with impatience, began to saddle him with the most scrupulous care, without forgetting a single strap or buckle. He seemed no longer to disturb himself in the least about the wolves outside, though their yells had redoubled in intensity. A dark suspicion crossed Glenarvan's mind as he watched him. "He is going to desert us," he exclaimed at last, as he saw him seize the reins, as if preparing to mount. "He, never," replied Robert. Instead of deserting them, the truth was that the Indian was going to try and save his friends by sacrificing himself. Thalcave was ready and stood champing his bit. He reared up and his splendid eyes flashed fire. He understood his master. But just as the Patagonian caught hold of the horse's mane, Glenarvan seized his arm with a convulsive grip and said, pointing to the open prairie, "You are going away." "Yes," replied the Indian, understanding his gesture. Then he said a few words in Spanish, which meant, "Thalcave, good horse, quick, will draw all the wolves away after him." "Oh, Thalcave!" exclaimed Glenarvan. "Quick, quick," replied the Indian, while Glenarvan said, in a broken, agitated voice to Robert, "Robert, my child, do you hear him? He wants to sacrifice himself for us. He wants to rush away over the pampas and turn off the wolves from us by attracting them to himself." "Friend Thalcave," returned Robert, throwing himself at the feet of the Patagonian, "Friend Thalcave, don't leave us." "No," said Glenarvan, "he shall not leave us." And turning toward the Indian, he said, pointing to the frightened horses, "Let us go together." "No," replied Thalcave, catching his meaning. "Bad beasts frightened, Thalcave good horse." "Be it so then," returned Glenarvan. "Thalcave will not leave you, Robert. He teaches me what I must do. It is for me to go, and for him to stay by you." Then seizing Thayuka's bridle, he said, I am going, Thalcave, not you. No, replied the Patagonian quietly. I am, exclaimed Glenarvan, snatching the bridle out of his hands. I myself, save this boy, Thalcave, I commit him to you. Glenarvan was so excited that he mixed up English words with his Spanish. But what mattered the language at such a terrible moment? A gesture was enough. The two men understood each other. However, Thalcave would not give in, and though every instant's delay but increased the danger, the discussion continued. Neither Glenarvan nor Thalcave appeared inclined to yield. The Indian had dragged his companion towards the entrance of the ramada and showed him the prairie, making him understand that now was the time when it was clear from the wolves. But that not a moment was to be lost, for should this maneuver not succeed, it would only render the situation of those left behind more desperate, and that he knew his horse well enough to be able to trust his wonderful lightness and swiftness to save them all. But Glenarvan was blind and obstinate, and determined to sacrifice himself at all hazards, when suddenly he felt himself violently pushed back. Thayuka pranced up and reared himself bolt upright on his hind legs and made a bound over the barrier of fire, while a clear, young voice called out, God save you, my lord. But before either Thalcave or Glenarvan could get more than a glimpse of the boy, holding on fast by Thayuka's mane, he was out of sight. Robert, oh you unfortunate boy, cried Glenarvan. But even Thalcave did not catch the words, for his voice was drowned in the frightful uproar made by the wolves, who had dashed off at a tremendous speed on the track of the horse. Thalcave and Glenarvan rushed out of the ramada. Already the plain had recovered its tranquility, and all that could be seen of the red wolves was a moving line far away in the distant darkness. Glenarvan sank prostrate on the ground and clasped his hands despairingly. He looked at Thalcave, who smiled with his accustomed calmness, and said, Thayuka, good horse, brave boy, he will save himself. And suppose he falls, said Glenarvan. He'll not fall. But notwithstanding Thalcave's assurances, poor Glenarvan spent the rest of the night in torturing anxiety. He seemed quite insensible now to the danger they had escaped through the departure of the wolves, and would have hastened immediately after Robert if the Indian had not kept him back by making him understand the impossibility of their horses overtaking Thayuka, and also that boy and horse had outdistanced the wolves long since, and that it would be useless going to look for them till daylight. At 4 o'clock morning began to dawn. A pale glimmer appeared in the horizon, and pearly drops of dew lay thick on the plain and on the tall grass, already stirred by the breath of day. The time for starting had arrived. Now, cried Thalcave, come. Glenarvan made no reply, but took Robert's horse and sprung into the saddle. Next minute both men were galloping at full speed toward the west, in the line in which their companions ought to be advancing. They dashed along at a prodigious rate for a full hour, dreading every minute to come across the mangled corpse of Robert. Glenarvan had torn the flanks of his horse with his spurs in his mad haste, when at last gunshots were heard in the distance at regular intervals, as if fired as a signal. There they are, exclaimed Glenarvan, and both he and the Indian urged on their steeds to a still quicker pace, till in a few minutes more they came up to the little detachment conducted by Paganel. A cry broke from Glenarvan's lips, for Robert was there, alive and well, still mounted on the superb Thayuka, who neighed loudly with delight at the sight of his master. Oh, my child, cried Glenarvan with indescribable tenderness in his tone. Both he and Robert leaped to the ground and flung themselves into each other's arms. Then the Indian hugged the brave boy in his arms. He is alive, repeated Glenarvan again and again. Yes, replied Robert, and thanks to Thayuka. This great recognition of his favorite services was wholly unexpected by the Indian, who was talking to him that minute, caressing and speaking to him, as if human blood flowed in the veins of the proud creature. Then turning to Paganel, he pointed to Robert and said, a brave. And employing the Indian metaphor, he added, his spurs did not tremble. But Glenarvan put his arms round the boy and said, why wouldn't you let me or Thalcave run the risk of this last chance of deliverance, my son?